Hi, everyone. My name is Peter. Welcome to the Wealth Disparity and Student Politics Terp Talk today. I am joined by Datun and Brian, who are my co hosts. Guys, how's everyone doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. What about you, Brian?
Great day, great day. So happy to be here.
Awesome. All right. So, for the last couple of months, we've been compiling a lot of content for this premiere pilot episode. And the first thing that we want to talk about for our podcast is wealth disparity. Um, we are all very passionate about this. When we first got together, we all three of us all had like pretty similar aligning views for what we thought the United States had trouble with this issue, but we all have our specific topics that we honestly wanted to talk about. So without further ado, one of the things that motivated us to talk about this is what aspect of wealth disparity in the US that we thought interesting. Specifically, what I think is really, really interesting is the types of disparity that isn't just liquid. We talk about money, we talk about real estate, we talk about things that are set in stone that we understand is like tradable commodities. And we understand that some people don't have as much money as other people. We understand that people don't have as much real estate or as much, should I say, like physical matters that people own. One of the things that I was really interested in is things we don't think about every day, like information. And I will talk a little bit about more how information plays a part in wealth disparity. But what about you guys? What made you guys interested in this topic before we even started?
So I would say wealth inequality is really interesting, and it's a very important topic to me because I think that a lot of people recognize the United States of America as, one of the giants across the nation. But, as an American, and my fellow co-hosts can probably relate to the fact that sometimes we look across America and we wonder, like, how are people struggling this much and how are other people gaining this much from the same systems, right? So after looking a little bit more into it, I kind of realized that wealth inequality in the United States isn't just about who has more money and who has less money. It's a lot about the history that America has been founded on. It's a lot about the power that certain individuals, groups, and families have had access to. And it's also just about the different types of resources, and the availability of resources to different groups. So kind of the more I looked into it, the more I saw how deeply rooted the wealth gap is, and specifically the racial wealth gap is something that I'm personally very interested in. Um, we know that there are like centuries of policies that have evolved to help some groups while excluding and blocking wealth from other groups. And it's interesting because even today, although this is a historical issue that stems from, some could say the foundation of America, it still affects us very deeply. And past injustices um, are still affecting marginalized communities. They're still reeling from these injustices. So I just think it's interesting because it challenges this idea that if you'll work hard, you'll make it, when some groups don't have the opportunity to. But what
I
about you, Brian?
I totally agree. Like being able to not work hard enough and not make it is definitely one of the things that I thought was extremely interesting about the wealth disparity issue. What about you, Brian? What made you interested in this topic?
Yeah, I mean, going back to what both of you guys said, I think when I, started my research on this topic and I looked a bit back on like the history of the United States, and some people might think that this is a new issue or started not that long ago, but in my research, I found this was like the United States kind of founded on wealth disparity and the inequality. Some people were just always an advantage. Of course, we'll talk about redlining and the history of slavery that we saw throughout history during the Industrial Revolution. How some people were just, tycoons in this pool of business, and how they took advantage of laborers and they discouraged unions, and they just always had the upper hand on the working class. So for me personally, my interest was in how has this been such an issue for centuries, centuries, and we still live in a world today where I think we're one of the most advanced. societies. And this is an issue that's being solved anytime soon. I think we'll still see it through our lifetime and future lifetimes. So I think I was mostly interested in the history of it, how it came to be, and really what's being done about it. What type of regulations, policies have been best designed to help this issue, and how sometimes people find their way around certain tax policies, certain type of legislation that's passed. So I think for me, examining these type of different uh, policies and these different types of rules that have been, try to help the working class people, try to give them the upper hand. It has been enough. And I guess, my question in all this has been, what will we ever be in a society where, middle class are making enough, lower level, lower income people, can survive on their minimum wage job. So that's what brought my attention to it, and how this crisis of wealth and not having the basic necessities to live day by day while people are living beyond the necessities of the top 1%. So that's what I find fascinating about this topic.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Like, for students listening, we are most likely, whoever is listening, we are most likely a part of the working class. So, what's really like interesting about this topic is that it's so applicable to anybody who's most likely anybody who's watching or listening today. I think it's very important that we remember, and Brian, you mentioned this, that this issue is not going to be solved tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. This is a problem that is going to take years and years and years for people to work on. But Brian, I think your part and your research for our project is so important because in order to solve this problem, we have to understand what caused this problem, and history and background, in my opinion, might be one of the most important parts in making this what project come full throttle and actually answering the problem today. For time reasons and not to overload people, for talking about this specific topic today for wealth disparity, uh, let's like kind of put a fine tune and like fine line and really hone in on what each of us are going to be talking about today. Uh, I am going to be talking about congressional stock advantages and some of the things that we don't know about it, and how that kind of shows how, if you're higher class and you hold higher power groups, higher power positions in the U.S. government, that you have advantages over working class people and other people that don't have those advantages, especially when working with the stock market. Datun, tell us a little bit about your specific topic. What are some of the key components are you going to be talking about to us today?
Sure, no problem. Yeah. So I'm going to be talking specifically about redlining.
Okay.
Um, in specific, it's interesting to me how redlining was like a government-based practice.
Hmm.
So this is something that the government was intentionally kind of doing in order to kind of color code different maps and distribute wealth throughout home ownership. I'm basically just going to kind of discuss how the way that we've done homeownership and how banks have denied or approved loans has inherently been discriminatory within our history of America. Moreover, I'm just going to kind of talk about how redlining didn't just segregate neighborhoods, but it also created like a huge gap in how people were able to build wealth in America, and how that specifically has affected brown, black, and other marginalized communities in the United States.
Yeah, redlining is, I know, a specific and giant issue Baltimore has over the years. So I'm excited to hear about what you have to say later in this podcast. Brian, tell us a little bit about what you're honing in. You said you're going to be doing history. Tell us a little bit more specifics on that.
Yeah, for sure. I think, understanding the history of this issue is, a key part of, what we want to talk about today. So, I'll be talking about, where this really comes from. I think the United States has gone through many different eras, and in each era we see large groups that are, money hungry and will do anything to be an advantage. And then we see constant eras of people being taken advantage of, being stripped from their rights, not being given a proper wage. So again, what I want to talk about is the history and how in each type of era that the United States goes through, this is a constant problem. Um, Colonial times, Industrial Revolution, um, and today. So I think I'm going to be talking about each step the United States has taken in its history and how this problem is reoccurring and vital issues in each time period that just kept increasing the wage gap and yeah.
All right, sounds good. All right, well, without further ado, let's start off with Brian. Brian, tell us about the history. Lay down the land for us. I'm excited.
Yeah, of course.
Let's hear what Brian has to say, guys.
Yeah. So United States, I'm going to take it back to colonial America. That's really where this problem has started. So from the start, wealth in America has been tied to land, and land has been tied to power. But access to land wasn't equal. Indigenous people were violently displaced. Enslaved Africans were brought and treated as property in the United States. And wealth creation for many colonists, relied on exploitation, whether through slavery, stolen land, or forced labor. Wealth, early wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, and often passed down through families, which starts this topic of generational wealth. So if you were a white landowner, you had access to wealth and political power. If you weren't, especially if you were black or indigenous, you were excluded entirely. So, we're already starting off with these marginalized groups being not only stripped from, personal rights and liberties, but this is the start of where I see, a class divide between white people and people of color. So then I want to fast forward to industrialization, and the Gilded Age of a new class divide. So if we fast forward to the 1800s, we see the U.S. becoming a increasing, booming industrial power. There's factories, railroads, steel, and these industries have made quite a few men incredibly rich. I mean, you think of names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan. This was the prime Gilded Age, a glamorous. It was glamorous on the surface. It caused this boom in the United States, but deeply it was unequal, right? Industrial workers, many of them immigrants coming from countries, fleeing, trying to find a new life in the United States. They were labored in dangerous conditions for poverty wages. I mean, these people were making cents on the day, um, while the economic elite, lived near house estates, owning multiple mansions, properties. So there were virtually no labor protections and monopolies crushed competition. There was no regulations to hold these people accountable. At the same time, Reconstruction was ending in the South, and Jim Crow laws were systematically stripping Black Americans of political and economic gains. Sharecropping replaced slavery in many ways, but keeping Black families trapped in poverty. Then, guess again, fast forwarding into a new era. In the 1929, we see the stock market crash. The country was plunged into a Great Depression, and for the first time, Americans saw what unregulated capitalism could lead to on a mass scale. We saw unemployment, homelessness, hunger, and the crisis opened the door for FDR's New Deal in the 1930s. So this New Deal created Social Security, unemployment insurance, public works programs, and stronger protections for workers. So wealth was taxed more heavily, and unions gained real power. So these programs help reduce inequality, but it's important to note that many of them excluded Black Americans. So, for example, domestic and agricultural workers' jobs held disproportionately by Black people, and they were left out of Social Security. So this idea that was meant to help the low income kept even then kept excluding people of in the minority. So even as overall inequality fell, the racial wealth gap remained locked in place. So nothing was really being done about this racial wealth disparity. And then if we take a look to the middle class, and we look at the post-war boom. So after World War II, the U.S. experienced this massive economic growth. This period is roughly this is a roughly there's a rough period from the late 1940s to the early 1970s. Um, and sometimes it's called the Great Compression because wealth was more evenly distributed than at any other time in the U.S.
Right.
And there were a few reasons for that. Unions were strong and could negotiate good wages. The federal government invested heavily in housing, infrastructure, and education. The top marginal tax rate on the wealthiest Americans was over 90% at one point, and GI Bills helped returning soldiers go to college and buy homes. So this was a time where people were finally given a chance. Even though they might have had a rough start economically in their lives, they were coming back, whether that be for more or they were given this new opportunity to have a fresh start. But there was obviously a catch. Now, these benefits were often racially exclusive, and as Dotun will talk about later, it was redlining by the FHA kept black families from buying homes in the suburbs. Many black veterans were denied access to GI Bill benefits. So while the white middle class was skyrocketing and boomed, communities of color were systematically left out. Again, we see the same pattern. And then if we jump again to a new era of the United States, starting in the 1980s, we see the Reagan administration, and the government took a sharp turn in this era. Taxes were taxes for the wealthy were slashed. Corporate regulations were rolled back. Unions began to decline, and this was the beginning of the kind of a neoliberal era, which favored free markets, globalization, and minimal government interference. And the logic was that a rising tide lifts all the boats, but in practice, most of the gains went to the top. CEO pay exploded at this time, while wages for the middle class and working class stayed the same and sometimes even decreased. So we see here the minimum wage loses its value. Jobs were outsourced, and job security became a thing of the past. And to that, the racial wealth gap, which widened even further again, especially after the 2008 housing crisis. Um, Black and Latino families lost a disproportionate share of their wealth when the bubble burst, largely because of their wealth was tied to their home ownership. Sometimes all these families that's all they own. Um, so when they lose this home and this neighborhood that they put all their life savings to, this creates again another step down for them. While you know people are taking a step up each era. So as we see today, we haven't seen something like this in a long time. Even today, we're living in an era of extreme wealth concentration. Just to get some statistics, the top 1% of Americans owe more wealth than the entire middle class combined.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it's a serious conversation to have, and that kind of leads me to think, where does this leave the U.S.? Wealth inequality in the U.S. Isn't new, obviously. It's been baked into our system from the start, reinforced through policy, passed down through generations. But at a certain moment in history, we've seen things that can change. So when there's enough public pressure and enough political will, I think we might be able to move in the right direction. But I think that's a conversation that we might be able to have later. But as of right now, that's a brief history of this research that I've put together. I think it's important to notice each era and how sometimes it was a stepping stone up, but two stepping stones down. So yeah.
Cool. So, Brian, you talked a little bit about solving the problem. What I noticed, what really grabbed my attention from what you said is, in your research, after World War II, wealth disparity and wealth inequality started to decrease. Yeah, and in my experience, when I was doing my side of the research for things, seeing that um, after World War II, the necessity for manufacturing increased. So, what do you think? Like, do you think there needs to be now to disrupt this wealth inequality? Do you think there needs to be some type of like common task that we need to adopt? Like, whether it be creating new technologies, something that I think about is like solar panels. Like, we always need to like develop like more like energy like resolutions. Like, what do you think could we do as like a country to put a demand on a resource that we need that we can have people get more jobs from like something like that, like a task. Like, is there anything you
Yeah,
think that could work like that?
yeah. I mean, that's really rough, especially in, today's society and today's technology. I mean, we can't compare jobs after World War II to jobs today. After World War II, there were a lot of factory jobs. People we needed like kind of all hands on deck in the U.S. government. A lot of people on the ground, factory workers, and that's really a problem because we've seen a lot of those factories jobs being outsourced to other countries. A lot of people are losing American jobs. A lot of people are being displaced. Um, but I guess the equivalent to factory jobs coming back from the U.S., coming back from World War II, would kind of be like ordinary retail jobs here in the U.S. In current society. I think these types of jobs are meant are meant for people to put something on the dinner table every night.
Right.
But it's a lot harder when no, there's been this norm in the system of okay, if you didn't make it, if you didn't reach this type of level by this age, there's nothing that can be done for you. And it's really, really hard to come up with this new type of innovation, especially when we see the way society is aiming, the type of leaders that we have in the country, the type of you know resources that people are being offered. I think off the top of my head, it's really tough to think of something that some type of job force that could come together and kind of solve this problem at this time. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. You talk about like laws and policies that we like need to make and adopt to go forward. When tackling the problem wealth disparity, we see generalizations of laws being made like healthcare acts, housing acts, affordable care acts. We see a lot of different stuff like that. Datun, you told us earlier that your research was primarily on redlining. Tell us a little bit about that. How does wealth disparity spark problems like this?
Yeah, of course. So kind of like as I was getting into earlier, as I hinted towards earlier, um, wealth inequality um, is a very, very, very interesting topic when we talk about redlining, because, like I said earlier, it was intentionally created in the U.S. And it was government backed, specifically in the 1930s, where neighborhoods would basically color code maps to show how risky they were to give someone a loan there. And spoiler alert, if the neighborhood was mostly black or immigrant, then it was going to be marked in red, which meant banks could deny loans or charge higher rates to these communities. So even if you were very financially responsible, you typically couldn't access the resources to buy a home, to build equity, to pass on wealth to your children, to
Hmm.
generations below. Um, on the other hand, families in green areas tended to be white families, and they were the ones who achieved favorable loans and watched their property values grow. Um, so there was a huge gap in those who were able to build wealth in America. And I'm going to get into more about how we're still seeing the effects today. Um, so just to go through a little bit of history, as Brian did, um, specifically, something that's important to know is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was the corporation that would mark neighborhoods as high risk or low risk for investment, um, and they would mark the neighborhoods green for the best ones to do loans for,
Hmm.
blue, which meant still desirable, yellow, which meant declining, and red, which meant hazardous. Um, and to start off in the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation and later the Federal Housing Administration institutionalized redlining by using those neighborhood maps. Um, and then in the 40s and the 60s, there were federal and private investment decisions through redlining, which made it nearly impossible for Black and marginalized communities to secure favorable mortgage terms, to buy homes, things of that nature. 1968, we finally have what we call the Fair Housing Act, which officially made redlining illegal. But many would say that at that point, the damage really had kind of like been exacerbated after all of those years. And white families had gained all of the access to the home ownership and generational wealth. Um, and then, till today, many formerly redlined neighborhoods still struggle with the low property values, under investment, and racial segregation. Um, so it's an unfortunate piece of history that Brian also got into, because it started so long ago and it has spanned to this very moment. Because if anybody even just looks at the U.S., they can see that marginalized communities are the ones who have typically been targeted in unfair decisions by the government, by the citizens of the United States. And this is one that not only affected people in the 1930s, but it are affecting people now. And also, as Brian hinted, it's going to continue to affect generations and generations to come. Um, in 2019, there was a Federal Reserve Board survey, and it showed that the median wealth of white families was approximately 8 times of that of Black families. So there's clearly still a really grand disparity that's occurring in the United States. And we know that homeownership is basically the number one way to build generational wealth in the United States. So that being something that's has historically been inaccessible to marginalized communities makes it incredibly difficult for them to kind of have a seat at the table in the power hierarchy in the United States. So yeah, that's basically redlining in a nutshell.
Okay, so we obviously redlining is very terrible and has created years of wealth disparity. Ditun, you mentioned how putting people who like work towards owning a home have to sit down certain mortgages and save up money to actually purchase homes. But then when departments label your own property in a redlining zone, that completely devalues the house. Sorry, guys. So what I'm trying to get at here, we have legislation in place like the Fair Housing Act. It's
Mhm.
2025, and there are million. The average age of owning a home, I believe, is at 38 years old. Where I'm 22 myself, I don't know. I have never thought about owning a home before. I don't know. I don't think growing up, I my parents mostly rented homes. I feel like we're adopting like a new culture here. Would you guys agree with that? Like, uh, I don't know. Do you guys find yourselves ever owning a home, or when?
Yeah, I would personally say that I think that as the generations roll on, it's becoming more like something that people just don't really think to do, especially from younger ages. I think in the past, owning homes were it was possible for people in their 20s. Immediately once they got married, that's what they looked towards doing.
Right.
But sudden like now it's like even our parents are like um the age of being able to access that homeowner status, which some would say is even a part of like the American dream. um it's really becoming farther and farther of something that's embedded in our culture. um and I think part of that has to do with the fact that as you mentioned, the Fair Housing Act, it outlawed housing discrimination, but the enforcement of it has been varied by administrations. So, it depends on the administration on how they've been handling housing. And the wealth gap has continued to grow regardless of the Fair Housing Act. And it also didn't mandate any active repair of damage that had already been done. So a lot of people bring up, reparations or other reparative policies that may be able to not undo what happened in the past, but close the gap. And that wasn't particularly mandated through the Fair Housing Act.
Right.
So it seems like we're just building and exacerbating the problem in the future, and it looks like the homeowner status is going to be essentially something of the past as we go down through generations.
I completely agree with you. I this is kind of a question for both Brian and I because you spent most of the time researching this. Brian, what do you think it's more important to have policies in place to never allow redlining and putting properties in zones where they'll be devalued, and that's where we see immigrant communities and black people like having a disadvantage at this for years, or should we look into maybe repairing the damage that we've done already? We've seen so many people at our age, older, unable to afford a home. Do you think it's possible to implement policy or legislation to where we can start giving back? And where would that money come from? Do you have any ideas on that, Brian?
Yeah, I think the idea of policy and legislation, I think that's important because I think that's a step in the right direction. But making make correcting these policies, we have to remind ourselves that there have been policies that that have been detrimental to these communities. So I think it's just enacting policy isn't gonna fix the legacy of some of these redlining communities.
Mm-hmm.
I think it goes more beyond housing. I mean, you think about people that try to start businesses, um, people that try to these small family startups, restaurants, small type of businesses that were pushed away because no one came to their side of the neighborhood. No one came to that side of the suburbs. So I think now is time. I think there's time. We need to have some type of drastic, like action, not just words on paper. I think there has to be some type of innovative measurement taken to say, okay, there's a history of this. Policies have, put these people in a bad situation, put these communities in a bad situation. I think not only do we reverse these policies, but we need to, take action on it. So I think it's more action over legislation. I think both are heading towards the right direction. And going back to what you were saying earlier about, a lot of people 50, 60, graduate college, get a job, buy a house, and they're homeowners at 25, 24. And they kind of there's like a type of attitude change when they look at, current this current generation where they think, people don't work hard enough or they don't, they don't want it enough. But,
Right.
it's not that at all. Times when, they were able to buy a house, we look at, I mean, obviously there's always going to be inflation. Look at inflation, look at the type of jobs they were having, look at the type of technology that there was back then. It's this attitude of I got this because I worked hard and I deserved it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little truth of you put yourself in a situation, but there's also this systemic and cultural shift that it's really hard to buy a house graduating college. It's really hard to get a good salary paying job out of college, and it's you look at the attitudes of a lot of people, a lot of generations look at it, and it also takes me back to my other point. It's going to take more than just the type of policy, some type of legislation. I think, we see a lot of um, inner city like policies that are heading towards the right direction, but then you see these neighborhoods 5, 10 years, and it's a slow progress, and these people are still living there, people are still trying to thrive in those communities, but it's not being done quick enough or as efficient as one like. And going back to your next question, where does the money come from?
Right.
Um, you know, People don't like taxes, you don't like paying taxes, but I think there has to be some help from the federal government, and that's obviously going to be different with you know current administrations or future administrations. But I think there needs to be some type of task force team or some task force administration that looks at these problems and says, okay, we need to better our cities, we need to better our schools, our education. This all has to do with the same problem of these people were placed in a situation that started off with incorrect policies and incorrect politicians. So I think it's really important to have the right attitude towards the policies and really take action. And it's going to take a lot of motivation from from maybe mayors, governors, presidents. I think that's the route it has to take for to see some quick change because I think I would like to see change in my lifetime. I would
Right.
like to see Baltimore be better. I grew up in Maryland. I would like to see the city that I often visited. Um, you know, not have these historically systemic aligning communities. So yeah.
I completely agree with you, Brian. Before we move on to my part, the tune, I have one more question for you for the redlining. We see the effects, we see all the negatives it's created, and now we see this demand for affordable housing. Whose job is that? We as students, we have deals and we have things that are implemented for us to have more affordable choices while we're going to college. Do you think the government, the US government is responsible for providing affordable housing for us after college or people who are going straight into the workforce who don't have that money? How do you feel about it? Do you feel that the US government has a responsibility?
I do think um, I do think the U.S. government has a responsibility. I think that at the very least, they kind of bear the burden of what the citizens are experiencing within the country.
Hmm.
Um, I think that obviously the economy is incredibly nuanced, and it's not as easy as a politician snapping their fingers and making all the prices of houses go decreasing. Um, Obviously it's not that simple. I'd hope if it were, then it would have already been done. But it's going to take more of a systemic and a more aggressive approach, as Brian was kind of hinting towards. Um, but yeah, to answer your question, I think it's the government's. I think it's the government's responsibility. I think that it's especially their responsibility because historically it's been their fault that there is this huge wealth gap. There's this huge racial wealth gap, and kind of um, getting into or hinting towards what you're going to talk about, Peter. The government is still doing things that are unethical. Um, Especially when it relates to how they're managing the money of the citizens, how they're managing um, the money of the country, how they're taking advantage of certain things. So we see this long history of people in political power taking advantage through the information that they know, through the power that they have. Um, and I think that especially because there has just been that long history of the government taking advantage, I think there should be a future push for the government taking responsibility. And yeah, so I think that kind of also transitions well into how there's modern day impacts still of wealth inequality and how that is affecting the Americans and such. So you can get into that.
Datun, well said, well put. Um, I I want to add on to what you just said for congressional stock trading. We see that wealth in the US or any country, it moves. We see wealth go into different things, whether it be like goods and things that we need. Brian, you mentioned after World War II, there was a necessity for manufacturing because every other country was destroyed and there wasn't that many people manufacturing anything. And then Datun, you mentioned that with redlining sparked um, more affordable housing programs and trying to get people more housing because their own housing could not sell for that much and could not be a reliable source of generational wealth. Now, what I'm talking about is congressional stock trading. Why is it important and why does it have to do anything with wealth disparity? One of the things that I was responsible for researching in our project was determining information. What is the wealth behind information? You guys, I want to set up a scenario for you guys. If I told you that I had a large oil well in the back of my yard and I am about to mine it, you guys would probably invest money for me to mine it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Of course.
This example is something that we see a lot in specifically Congress. Congress is responsible for making so many laws and legislation based on things that are developing. For example, COVID-19. What is something that you guys would assume that COVID-19 would require? What would be a product people would be buying more during COVID-19? Do you guys have any ideas?
Uh, Vaccines, masks. Um,
Yes. Yes.
Any type of
Absolutely.
pharmaceutical
Yeah.
necessity, yeah.
Exactly. We see that these necessities are laid out right in front of us. So what what the U.S. government usually tries to do is that they try to subsidize this and boost it with different acts and different laws that encourage certain products to be bought. We see this during we also see this with negatives as well. When we start to see the US government has a lot of information understanding how mortgages are paid and how much debt banks are in. We see that this is apparent in 2006 and 2008 where US government officials were selling lots of stocks uh, because they knew the market was going to crash because of the unpaid mortgages. And so there was huge outrage in this during 2006 and 2008 because people saw that Congress had insider information. And information is such an important part because it is not liquid, it is not physical like a house would be or like a car. Um, it is something that cannot be specifically worth that much, but it is worth a lot, especially in the law and legislation and wealth disparity conversation. In 2012, President Barack Obama um, initiated and called for a bill to ban congressional insider trading the way that it was today. We see the bill now. It requires congressmen and congresswomen to, within 45 days, announce what type of trade they're doing, how much of something they're trading, if they're selling or buying a stock, and they have it publicly posted so that it can be reviewed and make sure that they are not basing their stocks and selling stocks off of information that they got from developing laws. Something interesting about Congress is that we see there's different departments and people have certain responsibilities. For instance, Nancy Pelosi, she works in the technology department and she lays in a lot of different opinions and legislation ideas for subsidizing certain technologies. Now, tell me if this is suspicious or not. If you're working in a technology department and all of a sudden you have your husband sell and buy millions of dollars worth of graphics card stocks when you've just initialized a bill that subsidize graphics cards, you would think that's a little suspicious, right?
yeah.
Right. So we start to see this, and we realize, wait. Are congressmen and women taking advantage of us? How could this ever happen? Well, it happens every single day. I have a graph up here that shows about 100 different congressmen and women, and it's a portfolio outline. A lot of what my research came to be was determining whether or not they had advantage and what they were gaining out of this. Something that was interesting, one of the most interesting pieces of research that I saw was portfolio estimates. Most people, whenever they are constantly stock trading and selling stocks, they have a portfolio estimate for each year. And as you guys know, stock trading and is a, how should I say this, an intelligent way to gamble. And obviously, there are statistics that come with this where we see that, okay, someone's portfolio is going to do this well. What the graph shows is that congressmen and women tend to not only meet their portfolio standards, which is making a positive amount of money, they far succeed it by 20, 40%, and they're making millions of dollars off of creating laws and legislation that the general public and the working class knows nothing about. So this is another example of wealth disparity, but it connects well with our total research because we see that there is reasoning for putting more wealth into certain aspects of our society, whether that be housing, whether that be actual jobs being created. We see that Congress and the way that we make laws in the US is one of the most detrimental things to spreading and swaying wealth. So for you guys, I for what my co-hosts here, I want to ask you guys a specific set of questions. Do you, obviously you guys thinks that this is like a super suspicious topic, but how do you guys feel that, you know, I'm sure we're in our 20s here. We have voted at least once or twice, whether that be like a presidential election or something else. Do you guys have faith in your the people you vote for? Do you guys have confidence that they won't take advantage of you? Or are you guys unsure?
I can start. Yeah, I think it's really, really hard to say that, the people that I cast my ballot to, I put my 100% trust in them. Um, I think, but I think you always got to take your vote and elections and these Congress people, these presidents. You can't. You always got to assume they're saying something, but they're not always gonna be on your side. You're gonna vote for them because you like something you heard. Um, you like this policy that they're gonna enact, but there are gonna be moments where they're not always gonna have your best interest in mind. And going back to what you said, Peter, no, it's really hard to look at these Congress people like Nancy Pelosi, who a lot of times have a base salary, but you look up their net worth and it's in the tens of millions of dollars.
Right.
It's extremely hard to understand how they instruct these rules and these laws on everyday people, everyday stockbrokers, everyday big banks, but they're all doing it. So why would they turn against each other? So it's extremely hard to put my 100% trust, and it's really difficult to trust
Brian,
politicians and these congresswomen.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because on average, a Congress representative makes their salary is an average of $200,000 on average on all of the Congress representatives that we have. They're making a very good, decent amount of money, and on top of that, they are making millions off of stocks for some reason. And so, a lot of my research also went over the comparison of Congress representatives and real like finance professionals, and their statistics were looking over whether or not Congress representatives were actually better traders than finance professionals. And it didn't show that at all. And the data was showing that in order to be this good at predicting the market, you would need some sort of evidence. Now, um, improvement. What is the best thing to do? The Stock Act that was implemented in 2012 does not work. One of the things I mentioned was that it takes you have 45 days to let people know whether or not you've made a trade or not. 45 days, not the day after, 45 days. This is difficult because when you have 45 days of time to like say you've made this trade, there's so many things you could say. You could say, "Oh, the shift in this did that." They have so much leeway. I think one of the biggest things here is that we create more laws and legislation to make a difference, and we can do that by voting for people that are concerned about this issue. We're young, all of us here are young. Um, we have a sway in that. People listening to this have a sway in that. It's important to realize that we are voting for people that um, care about us and won't take advantage of us like this. Now, we're getting towards the amount of time we have for this podcast, guys. We talked a lot about a bunch of different topics. Datune, tell me a little bit what you thought about all of our compiled research here. How does wealth disparity, how would you outline wealth disparity? And how do you feel about our final conclusions and responses here?
Yeah, sure. I think I would definitely say that a good way to just describe this whole issue is just that it's kind of devastating. It's really just a sad thing to learn about. I think it's especially sad because it's not the problem isn't solved.
Mm-hmm.
Um, still coming up as we talked throughout this podcast. We're still discussing different ways to potentially solve the problem. There have been steps towards potentially solving the problem, like you mentioned, the Stock Act, fair housing, things of that nature. But unfortunately, the work is far from finished. There's a lot more that can that needs to happen, and the barriers today are so prevalent and obvious, and you can tell how it's really impacted different communities. Um, and I think that kind of as you were talking about, Peter, with the end of your discussion with congressional stock trading, um, I think another really devastating portion of it is the fact that the people who have the power to finally change the tide are still doing things that are inherently deceptive and secretive, and they're taking advantage from the people who really could use them the most. Um, so I think that it's it's really unfortunate, and I think that as you know, like you said, we're the next generation. We're the people who are going to grow up within this America. We're going to be the people, us and the people listening to this podcast are going to be the ones who have the opportunity to finally do something. So I'd hope that with all this information that we've provided and more information that's inevitably going to continue to come out about how the government is taking advantage of its citizens, I'd hope that finally within the generation to come of powerful political leaders in America will finally be the ones to, you know, just change the tide and do something and help the communities who have been the most hurt by this issue of wealth inequality.
Absolutely. Brian, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, of course, we've seen both in Claude in the U.S. We've seen the history, the centuries of policies, the systems, that have benefited some groups and visibly exclude other groups. So, from slavery to land dispossession to redlining to unequal access to education to employment, you know, the past continues to shape the present. Centuries of past instances. So, I think understanding the history is key if we want to move forward. It helps us see that these disparities aren't natural or inevitable. They were built, and that means that they can be challenged. We can put up some type of fight to change and have a better future towards a more equal, um, opportunity, minimize the wage gap, the wealth disparity. Um, and now I think the question is, what do we have to do? What are we willing to do? What type of actions need to take place? Um, and yeah, I think moving forward, we all want to have a better future, for ourselves, for others, for people coming up behind us. And it's addressing the past, don't, address that it happened, address that all these actions were taken in place, and these are the results, centuries later. So understanding the past is key, but I think the important aspect now is looking forward into the future, and how can we fix these wrongs.
Brian, well said. I totally agree with you guys. Outlining both of these issues, um, it all comes down to voting. This is the one of the biggest parts of this podcast is to highlight that this is a student issue, right, guys? We're all students here, and it's extremely important that we care about these subjects because these are the subjects that are affect not just our lives but everyone around us directly. Well, we're getting to the end of the podcast. Tune, Brian, thank you so much for joining me today on this awesome premiere episode. Um, Thank you so much, guys. We hope to see you in the next one. Thank you for watching, and yeah, thank you guys. See you later.
You guys.
Bye.
Bye.